Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're ready to get started here. My name is Lindsay. I'm the Communications Manager at the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. And it is so wonderful to see so many familiar faces today and so many new ones here. Thank you so much for coming out on such a beautiful spring day. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis peoples of this land and honor their enduring relationship to it. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of our funders, including the City of Saskatoon, Sask Lotteries, and the Shevchenko Foundation, whose contributions help make programs like this possible. We'd also like to thank the Virginia Center for Culture and Art for supporting Betsy. Our Executive Director, Jen Budney, is away today attending to her father in British Columbia. It has been her intention to host this conversation, so she sends her sincere regrets. She asked me to share how meaningful this project has been for the museum. At the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, our Artist in Residence program creates space for artists to spend time with our collection, to ask questions, and to explore connections between past and present. This exhibition marks the culmination of our fourth Artist in Residence program since 2023. Like all of our residencies, Betsy's work brings forward new ways of engaging with the collection and new ways of thinking about Ukrainian history and heritage. In this case, it has been especially meaningful to exploring Ukrainian Jewish relationships, and it has already brought many people into this space to engage in conversations that are thoughtful, nuanced, and at times challenging. Jen shared that this is the kind of work that museums must do. She extends her sincere thanks to Betsy for her trust in us and for creating an exhibition that has made this kind of dialogue possible. She also wants to thank our very capable board member, Dr. Joan Borsa, for stepping in to host this conversation today. Joan, who is herself an art historian and curator, has been very involved in all of our exhibitions and programs. We are so lucky to have her as part of our team. So just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Please make sure your phones are on silent. We're recording today. And we'd like to keep questions to the end so that we can pass the mic around and the camera can pick up everyone's questions. Now about Betsy's show. This exhibition we're discussing today, To Understanding Through Understanding, was developed during Betsy's 2025 residency with us. Through drawing and painting, Betsy explores identity, memory, and migration, tracing her family's roots to cities in Ukraine. What's especially compelling about this work is how it moves between the personal and the historical, bringing together intimate family stories with larger, often difficult histories of displacement, violence, and cultural memory. At its core, this exhibition sits in that moment where history becomes personal, and where personal history asks something of us all. And I'd add, on a personal note, I've known Betsy for many years, and it's been really, really special to have her here at the museum. And I really value the opportunity to spend time together and to learn more about your process and your history and where our connections lie. So I'm so happy to be able to welcome you here today. Please join me in welcoming Betsy and Joan.
So, welcome everyone, Vitaimo Si. It's an honor to try to step into Jen Budney's shoes once in a while and to have a conversation with Betsy, an artist who I have had many conversations with, whose work I respect and have always been inspired by. I find this exhibition very brave, and we're going to find out from Betsy today some of the discoveries, challenges, insights, relief that she has had during the process of producing it. I wanted to say, just by way of context, that Betsy and I do have a history, a good one. We both worked in the College of Arts and Science at the U of S. More recently, I had the pleasure of writing an essay for the project Journal of the Plague Years, which was at the Remé, and which she did with Donna Rose. And through all of those discussions, we've kind of developed a repertoire, and sometimes we think we should just record those conversations and skip something like this. But seeing as how you all showed up, we will try. So I'm going to start with a question which takes us just to Betsy's first introduction to the collection, because one of the things that this artist in residency program does is it throws artists into the deep end, into the collection, downstairs in the vault, and asks them to in some way engage or research with the objects, and then to in some way enter into dialogue. It could be through existing work or new work. But I can imagine that walking into the collection brand new poses a few challenges. And so I wondered, Betsy, if you could just talk about those initial sorts of stages, the early parts of your residency, the kinds of complications and questions that you encountered within yourself, and then where it has taken you. And particularly, did you always think about this being the form that the exhibition would take?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, first of all, for coming. Thank you, Lindsay and Joan. I will say that when Jen phoned me to invite me to do this residency, my first question was, are there any Jewish objects in the collection? And her answer was no, just some anti-Semitic literature. So that was our starting, our starting point. And we both acknowledged that it was going to be challenging, that this was kind of it was a new thing for the museum, and for her she was inviting people of different ethnic backgrounds to start new conversations. And whether I wanted to be one of those conversations was difficult for me at first because of really what was happening in the world. And I was going through my own process of how I felt about my own identity in relation to some of the events in the world as well. And I had already been working on a series of drawings which are on that wall, sort of dealing with conflict and violence that was going on. So I really had to take a breath and think about it, and also to think about my own sense of, I guess I'm going to just say it, being a Jew in the museum. Mm-hmm. Because, first of all, it was a role that, well, was very new to me, not just in the museum, but because of what was happening in the world, being seen, having people's view of me shift because of that, and to see me in that, as that identity rather than who I am as a person, whether you know me or not. So I feel like she was offering me an opportunity to go deeper into these questions that I was already turning over. So,
does this work, this mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think one of the things you've just said is something about the difference between maybe inheriting a label that is Jewish and navigating an identity that is Jewish, as you kind of look through the collection and think about, how am I going to make sense of this from my own perspective?
right, yes, that's well put, because I think, well, you and I had this conversation. Joan is from a Ukrainian background, and I am from a Jewish background. I didn't grow up thinking it was a Ukrainian Jewish background. I thought of it as a Russian Jewish background because when I was young, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. it was only till the Russian invasion of Ukraine that I realized that so many of the towns where my family came from were sort of turning up on the news, like Lviv. So just to get back to our conversation, I think it was early on that I asked you for, I just thought, well, what am I going to do here? I don't know anything about this culture. And it felt really strange. Also, it was a place that I knew that my family had to leave for reasons of economic deprivation, violence. I mean, I didn't know too much about the history, but I think that it was a negative view. And then you were saying you grew up with a similar opposite view. So right off the bat, I knew there were going to be challenges. And so I came into the museum kind of hesitant and a little bit scared and thinking, you know, what would my dead relatives think of this? And so I think some of the earliest conversations I had with people here, with Jen and Rachel Ormshaw, who isn't with the museum, but she was kind of guiding me through the collection. I brought this up right away, and I was a little hesitant. I was a little nervous about talking to them about it, but I knew that there had been protests at Remy Modern about some, sort of Middle East, Jewish, Gaza, Israeli issues, and I thought, well, could this happen with this exhibition? And I also thought, what if I come across things that are uncomfortable? How do you feel about that? And kind of 100% support is what I experienced. And so that was, Jen and Rachel, everybody I spoke to just said, we'll just keep talking about this, but we really want to do this. So that gave me a lot of permission to kind of go in the direction I felt I had to go in, which actually I didn't know at the time what it was. And in fact, Jen said, you don't have to take this on. And I have done a lot of paintings of eggs in my life, and I thought, oh, I'll just do, Pasanki Easter eggs with my paintings and call it a day. But I mean, I really did want to do this because of the time and because of the questions I had about my own identity, about what was happening in the world. It really felt like an opportunity that I couldn't turn down.
So with that kind of vulnerability and trepidation, you arrived at a title at some point, To Understanding Through Understanding, which to me seems so evocative of everything that is in the exhibition and all the issues that you were dealing with. And I think that it suggests, that title, To Understanding Through Understanding, it suggests a very hopeful message. And I guess that's one of the things we're all looking for these days, is something a bit hopeful. And I think it suggests that these complex histories can be in some way dealt with through respectful dialogue, analysis, meaningful interaction. So I wonder if you could just comment a bit about the significance of the title for you, how it frames this exhibition. And I know that it was a translation of a phrase, a Ukrainian phrase that came from a particular Ukrainian scholar.
On one of the first days that I came to meet staff at the museum, so the first thing is you get a tour of the collection, and access to the database so that you can see what's in the collection. But I'm just going to get back to that anti-Semitic literature. Jen had arranged with, I think, some people in one of the synagogue here to take it on. She actually got advice as to what to do with it, and but I was kind of curious about it too, and partly because of Journal of the Plague Year, which is the exhibition I did with Donna Rose. We used a lot of signs and text. So I was, at first I thought, well, could I do something with this? So I was in the library looking for the books, and I met Yaroslav Zurlov. Yaroslav. Anyway, he is a Ukrainian scholar, and he was here doing research. And his field of expertise, what he was researching, he's not Jewish, he's a Ukrainian, he's Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainian, is that correct?
Good enough.
Anyway, but his area of research was how the Ukrainian diaspora memorializes the Holocaust. And so I was really curious about how he got interested in that. We were having a conversation about that. Plus he had those books that I was wanting to find. He was interested in the same books. And we were talking about, it's funny, I can hardly remember how it came up, but I think I was telling him what I wanted to have happen from the exhibition, which is somehow a sense of greater understanding between communities that didn't always see eye to eye. And he wrote down this phrase in Ukrainian, and I remember Anastasia, who was the archivist, she's also left the museum. They were both Ukrainian speakers, and they were having this very intense conversation about what it meant in English. And they finally started writing things down, and they said, it meant moving from understanding to greater understanding, or from understanding to a deeper understanding or reconciliation. And they had this whole list of things, and I said, well, where did you find that? And they said, oh, we just Googled it. Anyway, but it stayed in my head, and because it was really what I was after. And what Yaroslav explained was the phrase came about in the 1960s, post-World War II, when Jewish scholars and Ukrainian scholars really wanted to find a way to talk about their differences and talk about what happened, the Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine. Almost 2 million Jews were murdered by the first wave of German occupation in 1941, and mostly shot into pits in the woods. And I didn't really know too much about that beyond Babi Yar, which Jen hosted a book group to talk about that book. And a lot of people don't know that much about it because the records were repressed under the Soviet rule. And when they opened up in the early 90s, that's when a lot of this information became more public, and a lot of researchers, like Father Patrick Despois, who has, he's been in the forefront of research on this part of the Holocaust, and he's done a lot of forensic research and a lot of interviews. So there was a lot of painful history that people were negotiating about collaboration, about really who was doing what, And they really wanted the communities to come together and be able to bridge their differences and move forward. And it really was part of the story that I was encountering, and also a part of what I was thinking about, not in terms of that history, but in terms of present, what's happening in the world now, that people are having so much trouble talking about, talking across differences. So that's why the phrase really stayed with me. And I reached out to Yaroslav to kind of get more information, and he's written an essay for the exhibition, which is available if anybody's interested.
There are some copies somewhere at the back. So with that sense of pain, the complications of digging into all of this, clearly, directly and indirectly, you're dealing with Jewish Ukrainian histories, relations, the full complexities, and it seems that, you know, where is it that we can have some of these conversations? Museums, hopefully, and galleries are one of those places. And I keep on thinking that they're safe places to have these tough conversations. And it seems to me that in a museum like this, which is quite intimate, you know, it's very small scale, it might be able to do some things a little bit differently than, you know, the largest of large public museums. And so I'm wondering if you found these tensions that you had to deal with working in a Ukrainian museum where initially you're identifying as Russian Jewish, or at least Jewish. How did you find this sort of process of navigating all of these questions within specifically a Ukrainian museum?
Well, I think I'm just gonna, just the phrase that Yaroslav and that we kind of decided to use for the show, I feel like that was what I went through myself. Because I came here really without much understanding of what I was, you know, of my history, of Ukrainian history, of Ukrainian Jewish history, and it felt very strange and foreign to me to be here as well. But I think the process of having so many conversations with staff, and then Jen introduced me to a lot of people, historians like John Paul Himka. He was really, his book, and then later meeting him. Also Nadia Foti-Onishuk, who's at the Ukrainian Studies Center at St. Thomas More, was very generous with her time and met with me to talk about Ukrainian history and the history of Polish partition, and you know, so many things I was encountering, like, you know, the border shifts and the name changes, and it was very overwhelming. So there were so many people that were helpful, like some people that I met also from the synagogue, and just the conversations in general, and also people bringing their own stories. So I feel, you know, as I spent more time, I started out feeling like, you know, what am I doing here, to feeling like this was almost a second home, and it was so nice that my studio was so close by that I could walk back and forth, and just feeling like, you know, I could come and talk to people and look at stuff anytime. So for me, that's really affirming that can happen in a place like, in any place right now. And I really feel like that's an important role for museums to, to be a place that can have these conversations and for artists to make work and talk about their work across differences.
I can't help but think about some of the difficult conversations I'm sure many of us have across dinner tables with family gatherings, where you know what you shouldn't talk about, and the more that we do that, the less we ever get to the issues we really do need to talk about. So, yeah, I think that there's something about the way that you broached it and the whole understanding sort of phrase, it's just so important. Now, okay, you started to do a lot of research. And it's one thing to do the research, particularly around family and around Jewish history, the relations, but then you had to give it a visual form. And that's another layer of translation. And I don't think that your practice always involves starting with research to this degree. And although you are a great researcher, and I know it comes into play often into your work, this was quite different. It was almost tipped upside down, where you researched first, and then somewhere along the line, the clarity started to emerge around what visual form it would take. So the research was always evolving, always taking you into uncharted territory. And I wonder if you want to offer any sort of insight into this whole research process that you went through.
Thanks for that question. This was an extremely research-intensive project, which partly because I came in not knowing very much about the history, even about my family. And and people gave me a lot of resource materials. So I did a lot of research. I did a lot of reading, books, online, various sites. There are so many sites that I didn't know about, like Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, and of course sites like Yad Vashem, and I don't know, I can't remember, but like shtetl.com, where you can look up the name of the towns your family came from and find out about, what happened there, what it was like. Ancestry.com, I did not know very much about my own family. I had a lot of information that various grandparents and my father also saved. I have tons of photos and documents that just sat in boxes for years and years. So a lot of it was piecing together the history of Jews in Ukraine, which went back centuries and centuries, why they ended up there, and what happened to them, and the same with my family. How did they end up there? How did they leave? Who were they? And they had lives there. It wasn't just one big tragic story. So what were those lives like? When I started, you can see in family tree, that's 4 parts of my family. My mother's father and mother's families, and my father's father and mother's families. And I didn't even know their names and where they came from, when they were born. I knew that I was named after 2 of them, and I wasn't sure which they were. So that was all part of the process. and then making something visual. I would say I think I begged Joan to come to my studio. I was like, what the hell am I going to do? I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I think I was drawing maps at the time.
That's right.
I started with the map because I really didn't even know what Ukraine looked like. And you can see one of the maps over there that I made. But, and then I started, you know, when I was starting to draw it, I just kept drawing it over and over again. And I realized that it was very representative of how much the borders shifted because my lines were shifting so much. And then I started to locate the towns where my family came from. And that was not as easy as it might sound because, especially in the case of one of them, my grandmother wrote an alliterated from Yiddish name of the town. And so the town, you know, just trying to figure out from that alliteration what the town actually was. So it's actually Starokonstantiv. That name on that tree changed 4 times because I kept getting it wrong until I didn't. So, but I'm just going to go back to the collection, which there's a piece on the wall of the 4 trees embroidered in red. And when I saw that piece, I think that's when the show clicked for me, or the visual part of the project clicked, because it's by a contemporary Ukrainian artist, and I'm going to try to remember the translation of the title, but it's called Homage to the Gardens of Eastern Ukraine Destroyed by Russian Nazis. And I found it so moving. I think partly because of the trees themselves and the destruction of the natural world as well as the physical buildings and homes. There's something just so moving to me, but it also, I felt it related to my own family. Like they had planted roots, they had planted trees, and they had to leave them behind because of probably some similar reasons. And I think it kind of brought me to some kind of the cycles of destruction that we visit on ourselves as humans. And I think that became the place that I started. So I started this piece, I started it I think with 3 trees because that's the only, I only knew the 3 towns to start. And it just kept getting bigger. And so these are the names of the places that my family lived in Ukraine. And I thought of it as the kind of the roots that they put down, the trees that they planted, but also had to leave behind, but also that, I don't know, I guess partly, originally I had this top stuff. I thought of it as hopeful because they left before World War II. They got out, most of them were gone by like 1906, some of them the 20s. When I started to read what happened in each town, there was a massacre, and that of course happened to all across Eastern Europe at that time. Pretty much every Jewish community was murdered. And that's when I started feeling I had to represent the people who were lost to these, who lived in those towns, who were left behind and what happened to them. And originally it was very abstract, but the more I read about it, and also Yaroslav shared this German photographer who actually photographed all this. I don't recommend looking at the pictures, but I did, and I really felt like I needed to give them human face, not make them abstract. So, and then also, I mean, just the visual process that we all go through to make art. Originally, I was looking up the birds that were common in Ukraine, and nightingales and storks, and they didn't really work too well. But I think I knew I wanted to put birds in, because to me they are a symbol of freedom and hope. So I think this piece, which I did call Homage also, really kind of was the most responsive to what I was learning here at the museum and through the collection. And I think I was telling somebody that the artist before me painted a, I don't know who here has seen the show before mine, but they painted a giant Ukrainian scarf with the flowers, and it was like big pink and red. And I'm sure that that's why I used pink and red. Well, the red's from the trees, but the pink, and people have asked me, like, why pink? And I'm just sure that it just stuck in my head, because pink, it was here.
We'll see what the next artist does. So clearly this piece, I think, anchors the exhibition, or at least for me, it does. And the correlation between it and the piece from the collection that you referred to, such a direct interaction and dialogue. The 5 trees and 5 locations in Ukraine, and then there's this piece here to the left that you've told us before that it was another location that family came from, but it was in Poland, and so you decided to give
That's right,
it
yeah.
separate sort of space.
Well, I thought, you know, I'm at the Ukrainian Museum, nobody wants my Polish history. But then, I mean, the Rosenwalds are from Poland. So I felt like I couldn't really leave them out. So I made them a tree as well. And they were from Kolbiel. And so, yeah, in my studio I actually attached it to this piece, but it didn't really work that way. I will say I did use Pisanki dyes to make part of this, as, you know, kind of the process of experimentation and how to kind of work things in. And I thought, oh, I'll just paint with these dyes, but it was a limited experiment. So, yeah.
So that takes me to my curiosity around this enlarged letter. I don't know how many people have had an opportunity to actually read it, but it's very moving. It's from a family member. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about where you found it, who it was that actually wrote it, and why you decided to include it.
I looked at a lot of letters and documents for this project, and I had originally thought I would include more blown up, but it just didn't work out that way. But this one, I felt it was just so much a kind of slice of life about how this is a letter. It's called, it says the Kessel story. So the Kessels were my father's mother's family, so my great-grandmother's family. And my grandmother's cousin wrote this to her about what happened to that family. So they didn't own, because Jews were not allowed to own land in the Pale of Settlement where they lived, which was pretty much all of Ukraine, parts of Lithuania, Belarus, all around. They were forced to live in this area, and they were not allowed to own land, and they could only have certain professions or jobs. But anyway, this family made bricks, and apparently Kessel means kiln. And it was a story of what happened. They, I guess, a lot of these townships were owned by Polish nobility, and so Jews were brought in to do certain jobs. But anyway, this family apparently was doing pretty well, and there were workers on the property that were drinking and got together in a group and attacked the family. And I think they all got away, but I think it would have been my great-great-grandfather was stabbed. And the fact that he ran into the river and the water was so cold it staunched his wounds. But after this happened, they left this place and they went to Staro Konstantiv, where I guess, I'm not sure, I don't think my grandmother was born there, but anyway, that's where they went. And that's how I found that name, because it says that they moved to Alt Constantine, which is the English translation of the Yiddish of this town. So anyway, it seemed to really encapsulate the history, you know, why the family could live there, what they were doing there, what happened to them there, and why they left. So that's why I included it.
And then you included a few pieces, extra pieces from the collection. There's 2 pieces right there, and then there's 3 pieces over here. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about why those particular pieces. I think they, in my mind, they expand the references to issues within Ukraine.
So I looked at a lot of stuff, and there was a lot of amazing work, and at a certain point I really wanted to include this Kurilek painting that looked to me like immigrants coming to a new land and coming out of darkness to light, but it turned out it was actually women bringing food to threshers in the field. So, you know, it was my interpretation, but completely wrong. So there were reasons that some of the pieces that I was interested in weren't going to work for the show. And then I looked at a lot of documents from the archive here, and that was one of the ideas that I had to maybe include. And then textiles, which there's an amazingly rich collection of textiles here. And I have textiles from my great-grandparents, so I thought maybe include both. But I looked at this suite of work. They're actually two watercolors from a series of, I think, 8 by a Ukrainian Canadian artist called Kathy Nikolaichuk. And the reason I looked at them was because the last artist, the one who I stole the pink from, had also talked about the, how they made the choices for their exhibition. And they said there was so much great stuff, and there were these pieces about Chernobyl, and we really loved them, but they just didn't fit. And I thought, I want to see those pieces about Chernobyl. And so these works were made, they were a reaction to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine. And some of the imagery just really felt that it had a kinship with the work I was doing, like the kind of the pit, and that is actually the trident, the Ukrainian trident, but it looked like a tree to me. And others that I wasn't able to include had, birds and trees, and so there was something really moving to me about the work. It's also kind of winsome too, so I like that about it, that it could be about something so dark but have light in it. And also it was an artist's response to traumatic events, which I was looking at a lot of work of different artists who were responding to autobiographical or, political, different types of events. And these ones are by also a Canadian Ukrainian artist, and they are a response to the Russian invasion. And the imagery of destruction, which I feel like we're all looking at so much, whether it be in Gaza or Iran, Israel, Ukraine, all over the world, we're looking at photographs of destruction, of the destruction of people's homes and infrastructure. And so this work, to me, really resonated. And I had been working on this piece also about that, those images that are really about the loss of home and roots that come through violence and war. So that's why I wanted to include them. And there were so many trees in the collection. So actually there was a wooden tree that I loved, and we just forgot to put it in. It was just one of those things. It was, I don't know, it just got left downstairs. So yeah, it's kind of serendipitous as well as being intentional.
Just a couple more questions. There used to be a display case right in the middle here, but we had to move it out so that we could get people in. And in that display case, you add a number of personal items from your family. And at one point, you were thinking of adding some things from the collection, but I think you decided against that. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about what's in the display case.
Okay. So one of the first things, after I got a space here, I brought a lot of stuff, like a lot of the photos and the documents that I had. And I went through, I had this stack of textiles, like tablecloths and, I don't know, ritual kind of things to cover bread with. I never really looked at it that much. I moved it from my grandmother's houses to New York, where I lived, to here when I moved here. I just had them with me, and I brought them out and I brought them here. I brought candlesticks that were brought from Ukraine by my great-grandparents and grandparents. And there's a menorah, and then some jewelry. And when I brought it here, I looked over it with Rachel, who I was working with, and she was very knowledgeable about textiles, and so we looked at a lot of textiles in the collection together that had an affinity with the textiles that my great-grandmothers made. So there was something really, I think that what was moving to me was the commonalities. So we had really wanted to include both the Jewish and the Ukrainian objects to show that there was a common culture, that people lived there and they used similar things. They made things that influenced each other, that there was a story of community as well as some tragedy as well. And interestingly, the exhibition in the next room is Ukrainian fashion and how it influenced mainstream fashion. And the curators of that exhibition were visiting, and they spent time with me looking at my family's textiles and telling me the story of what they were made for, how they were made, like the rose pattern that is common to both Ukrainian and Ukrainian Jewish textiles, they said came to Ukraine through French soap packaging. And that it was, people imported this soap and they saw these roses and then they started to embroider them. And, some of the black and red, I don't know the story of that, but, and a lot of the stuff that my great-grandmother made was just pure white. And they said that would be just for special occasions, for holidays. And so I have, and also the lace in them, there was no lace, they didn't have lace makers. They would actually hand stitch all this lace. So that was really interesting to me. I never would have known that. And so eventually there just wasn't room for everything. We found irons that matched the irons that I brought from my family. Yeah, there were a lot of commonalities, but unfortunately I couldn't include everything. And then a lot of the photographs and the documents, I learned stories. I don't think I mentioned this, but I reached out to a lot of family members that I had never met before, second cousins and people who, I would ask one family member, like, who would be able to identify these people? And they would say, well, you really need to get in touch with this person. And so I got in touch with a lot of family members that I have never met, but they were all I feel like I grew my family. And they were all so helpful. If you look at, there's people I didn't know who they were, and now I do. And some of the family sent me photos and documents about, immigration papers and naturalization papers. So that was really moving to me. And also I included a lot of that information in the case.
And I understand that you discovered a cousin of yours is a registrar in the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
Yes, my second cousin Laura. Who knew? I never even knew she existed, and now. She's the registrar at the Holocaust Museum. and she actually introduced me to her father, who I guess he must have been a late child, but he knew a lot of the people I couldn't identify on one side of my family.
So with all these surprises and discoveries as your project evolved, has your relationship to Ukraine or the idea of Ukraine changed?
Totally, yeah, really. Yeah, I don't, it's difficult to kind of say I identify as Ukrainian still.
It's okay, say it.
I'm Ukrainian. The stories are challenging, but I feel, I learned so much, and I feel like I understand so much more about the history and just how, I think that what happens with so many nationalistic and ethnic, especially these, it's not especially, it's a historic fact, but there's a tendency to see things monolithically and not break down the nuances, the reasons why certain people bring certain points of view to certain experiences, because we all come from different places, we have different upbringings, backgrounds. So I think that it was just so kind of beautifully informative, and I learned from so many different sources about the country and about its history and about the history of Jewish relations there, that it was like an immersion. So, and I think some of the things I was searching for, I can't say that I have the answers for, especially what's happening in the Middle East, and I can't, that was one reason I wanted to take this on, is because I really didn't understand so much, and I think as a Jew, so much was sort of, I won't say put on me personally, but it was a changing identity, and one I didn't really understand or relate to, but one that was very painful, that I wanted to understand better. And I feel like the history has helped me understand certain parts of how we got here. And it hasn't really alleviated the pain or the confusion, but it's really helped me identify how sort of enmity against each other, against different groups, and the violence that can engender has, kind of gone on and on and on to create so much of where we're at now. So
I'm just going to reflect on a particular book that I've been reading by Danny Shapiro, called Inheritance. And the reason I'm mentioning it, and then we're going to go into Q&A, is that it feels to me that you had all of this archival material. You had these boxes sitting in the garage, unopened for a long time. It feels to me as if something was waiting, to happen. This show, perhaps, was waiting to happen. And I'm referring to that book by Danny Shapiro because she digs into her genealogy and her family history, and particularly her Jewish history, and some of the complexities. And in it, and I'm going to read a quote, I can turn the page. she refers to the concept from generation to generation, which I think is embedded in your idea of to understanding through understanding. And she suggested that in looking at the black and white photographs of her ancestors, that something just really started to shift in her, and something started to fill in. And so these are her words. She says, "I can almost make out the cadence of their voices, voices I have never heard, but that are the music of my bones." Does this in any way resonate with you?
It does, yes. I felt kind of like I had this group growing larger around me, kind of taking me through this, that, you know, I hadn't experienced. And it was really meaningful. It really touched me, yeah. I didn't know, and so many of these people, their names, who they were, and then I realized they were, you know, family. And they look like, I look like them, and you know. And also so many of them, kind of, the ones that are living, really, I've gotten to know better, which has been really lovely.
Okay, folks, what have you been thinking about? What would you like to ask Betsy? In no particular order. Okay, here we go. Front row.
Betsy,
Well, we're going to give you a microphone.
oh, thank you. I've got an awfully loud voice. Hello. Hello. I had an aunt named Auntie Kay, my mother's sister, who was wild and crazy, and she would talk to me about all the dark secrets of her family. And there were some doozers. I'm wondering if there was anybody in your actual family who could talk to you when you were a lot younger about such things as the Holocaust.
Good question. I think my generation of elders chose not to talk about it. And I regret that I didn't ask more questions. You know, I really thought it was something that didn't happen to me or my family. And I'm kind of ashamed of that, but because it's very clear that it did. And it could. But no, like the closest, it's really this project in a way. Like I asked, I had notes from my great aunt. I had talked to her. She lived till 107, so I did have the opportunity to ask her questions because I was grown up enough to think of them. And she said there were relatives that she just stopped hearing from. That's about the extent of it. She was from Lviv. That part of the family, the Greens, were from Lviv and Belz. And it had been in Austria. It's now in Ukraine. But yeah, some of them stayed behind and they just stopped writing. And just a couple of months ago, I got one of my second cousins on the Rosenwald side sent me some photos. And I looked up, they're from Kolbiel, Poland, and I looked the family up there. And the sisters, some of the sisters of my great-grandmothers didn't leave. And I was able to trace their train ride to Auschwitz on Yad Vashem. So I really didn't know, and I knew because I'd seen Holocaust films as a child, which pissed me off. I didn't think I should be made to see this stuff when I was so little. And that is part of what I think hardens and forms certain points of view. But I mean, it's a reality, and I should have asked more questions. I think I had one relative that had numbers on his arm, and it was sort of whispered, like what that was, but really not too much in terms, even even about the war in World War II in general. It was kind of a silent generation.
Hi, Betsy.
And Lisa.
I'm reading a book at the moment, just talking about books, reminding us of things that many here may know, called Investigative Aesthetics by Matthew Fuller and Idle Weisman. And what they do is bring together, they have a pretty broad definition of aesthetics that I don't quite understand, but anyway, it's about seeing. It seems to me that what you have done in this project is investigate, far beyond just doing some historical, research or something like that. And part of their insistence about the importance of investigative aesthetics, they do things like investigate the Grenfell Fire or Black Lives Matters or genocides in various places in Africa and stuff, and use not only archaeology but art and various techniques, but they insist that it's important to show their findings in galleries. I think I could take my thinking about that book, sketchy, in many directions, but one thing I'm wondering is, I really hope this wonderful exhibition has a future life, and what's next. But I think you've very powerfully shown how important it was for you to do this investigation and work in a Ukrainian museum. How would it be different if it were shown, do you think, in a different white cube or whatever you want, a different space that isn't a Ukrainian museum, but something else, say, you can fill that in, but would the meaning change in some way, or, because this just seems to me such an amazing project, and thank you everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa. I never would have done this project if it weren't for the Ukrainian Museum. It challenged me, and it challenged me to see things in a certain perspective, I think, in relation to history, in relation to my family. I don't know, I have thought about it, where it might work. I don't, I'm still working. I didn't finish all the work for it, so I'm still working on some work, but I'm not sure really how it would work in say, a so-called white cube. I think that there's actually an opportunity in any space to start conversations, and I would certainly support that. I feel that's something that Donna and I really wanted with Journal of the Plague Years, and really got, because just about everyone who came in told us their pandemic story, and a lot of them made signs and responded. So I think that it has a place in a context in different spaces, but I don't know. I know that there's something so special about having it in this space, and also because of the collection, and really because of the well, because of the staff too, and their mission, and we were kind of getting our feet wet together. So that there was something really kind of beautiful about that.
I told them I was first.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I have a loud voice. Hi. Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us. It's very profound. And I first want to say is how lucky you are that you have this amount of memories, because my parents were survivors and I have nothing. I have nothing that belonged to my grandparents or even aunts and uncles and stuff like that. My parents basically came from Europe to Israel and then to Canada with, I guess, a suitcase. I mean, I have nothing. I do have one picture of my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side. The other thing I just want to mention is when you started talking, you mentioned about being a Jew in a museum. Do you remember what that was right at the beginning? So the first thing that came to my mind is that one of Hitler's objectives was to kill all of the Jews and only have stuff in museums of Jews. So there would be no Jews in the world, but their stuff would be in museums. Like you'd have memorabilia of Jews in museums, like we have memorabilia of the Romans and or the Vikings or something and stuff like that. But that was one of his objectives, and I don't think we should forget it. The other thing is, and you just kind of mentioned, are there pieces now that have evolved in you from the process and spending time with people, talking in your exhibitions? Are there other pieces you now want to add to your collection?
Thank you for Thank you for sharing that, Shoshana. That's really moving, and I am really grateful that I do have so much from my family. Hoarders though they may be. I think the pieces that I didn't, there's one piece that I haven't finished, and it was one, I think it was the piece I started with, because it started with the map of Ukraine, and it just kept changing. The more I learned about the history, I kept thinking, oh, I've got to add this, I've got to, and it wasn't that big a painting, and so I kept adding things, and but I mean, I think that piece was much more about, it encompassed more of the history of violence, which I think in a way it's just much more subtle in the work that I have included. So I think it's a piece I was working out a lot of stuff with, and that's why it just kept changing and changing and changing. So I don't know, I don't know how it will end up, but it's sort of in a kind of still semi-complete state. And you know, there were a lot of ideas that I had that I just didn't get to. So I hope that I hope that I do. I hope that I can keep on working on it.
Thank you. So your work here on the wall here in the bottom of the front big piece shows a lot of trauma. And we weren't alive at the time, and yet we still feel the trauma. So my question to you is to talk about perhaps how that gets passed on from generation to generations. And here we are today trying to have a conversation between the different groups, Jewish, some came from Ukraine, you and I, and the ethnic Ukrainians, and neither of us was involved in fighting each other. We were both big victims, millions of people. But the question is about the trauma that gets passed on, and we're trying to still resolve that.
That's a good question. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I think that I don't know how to answer it really, except for that, yeah, I mentioned, I didn't have, I was sent to Sunday school, which was supposedly on Saturday, but it was actually on Sunday because it was in a Congregationalist church basement before the synagogue was built in my town in Massachusetts. And this movie that we saw had the bodies going into the chutes, into the ground from probably Auschwitz. So I just think, for me, that was not, I was a kid, none of that made sense, but I think you internalize those experiences not as a sophisticated political viewpoint or even anything you can make sense of at that age. You just think, wow, people can really hate me. And I think that's how I would say we experience generational trauma, is through internalized prejudices, the ones we feel against us and the ones we have against other people. And so that's, I guess, what I feel like basically the phrase that Yaroslav gave me, I feel like that was what those people were trying to bridge, and what I think is really kind of the way to go with those kinds of inherited traumas. Yeah.
Is there any other question looming?
Hi, thank you. What a powerful show and many insightful questions too. Something I've been thinking about that's been coming up over and over is a sense of time, the passage of time, whether it's the title itself, moving to, from something. This piece, you're talking about the layers of it and how you moved from kind of the broad strokes, which was a broad understanding, down to the minutia and the details and wanting to represent more of that. To maybe, I'm not sure if you felt this way, that it was almost bringing you closer to members of your family throughout history that you would never ordinarily have a chance to meet in person, of course. And it's really all distilling itself in this moment in time. You're representing it right now in this context. I'm curious about, obviously there's the political influence of this moment in time, but also, I wonder about kind of the influence of social media, or the ability to be digitally connected, or this unprecedented access to information, or especially maybe how you might have been feeling, you mentioned this at the beginning, feeling so much pressure about identifying and like representing a certain identity or a certain culture or heritage, and what that's like in the context of having so many eyes on you because of this moment in time. I guess that's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you, that's really interesting. I almost don't know what to add, because you really kind of captured everything I did experience in terms of how I felt and where it went. You did mention social media and also the internet, which I think afforded me, not social media, but the internet afforded me the opportunity to find out so much more that I wouldn't have been able to. I mean, even AI, just to put a name of one of my relatives who I couldn't track down and, get immigration, like the boat they came over on and where they landed. So that is, there's something more to that, because in terms of the time thing, sometimes I would forget the generation, like I would forget that my family wasn't there for this. That it was 1905, 1906 when they came over, they came to the US, but, and that, then the people left in these towns, what happened to them, which was 30, 40 years later, and then, the people I've talked to now and what's happening now, and how what happened then relates to what is happening now. So you're right, it has been sort of a cycle kind of thing, a cycle of time, and and even the most of the people in that family tree are no longer living. But I didn't include the people who are. It's so. So there's a lot of that. And just to say a word about social media, that is actually one of the things that was so difficult for me at the start of, right after October 7th and the start of the bombing of Gaza, was what was on social media. It was a real catalyst for me to start asking myself questions and looking into history before I came here. But because Jen reached out, I think because of that, I thought, okay, I've got to do this. Did you want to say something?
No. How about one last question here?
Okay. There's a field called epigenetics, which is very interesting and is just developing. But the idea is that if an individual in your family, in your past, one of your distant relatives experienced a very traumatic situation, that there is actually that sensitivity to that topic is passed down genetically to their children and eventually to you. So that this could explain, one of the good examples I think is with our First Nations, the ones that went to those terrible schools, and that has sensitized them to that sort of thing. So you might want to look into epigenetics. I don't know a lot about it, but I think it's very interesting and explains how subsequent generations could have this ongoing awareness and sensitivity to a particular event.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very interesting and helpful. I have read some things about that. I don't think I knew that phrase, but I mean, I think that is also, what I was talking about, that we all bring different things to how we interpret current events or any kind of event. And maybe you're putting it, that field is kind of putting it into a scientific context, and how why it's so persistent and why it's so difficult for us to communicate, but also why it's so important. But thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Huge thanks to all of you for being here and for the embrace in the room for this exhibition. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you, Joan.
Beautiful, powerful, tough, brave show. Those of you that can, please stay on and have some conversation with Betsy or whomever. There is a feeling of fellowship here that I hope continues, and hope to have all of you return to the museum as often as you like. And yes, just very grateful for the opportunity for Betsy and her ideas to materialize in our presence. Thank you.
Thank you.